Let's cut to the chase, have an honest conversation, and develop real answers. As a matter of fact, with Andrew Cuomo.
Hello, and welcome back to As a Matter of Fact. Thank you for joining me today. Last week, we spoke about a general overview of the political situation and where we are, especially in light of the upcoming midterm elections. But in general, what I want to do is take a specific issue that has been plaguing us for a long period of time and really get into the details and the specifics of that issue on a factual basis to see if we can make progress and move on. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the ongoing immigration crisis that is here in the United States. Now, there's much controversy surrounding the migrant situation on the southern border. I'm sure you've all seen it. And as usual, it's become just another politically polarizing situation. There are Democratic facts, and you listen to Democrats, they see one reality. Then there are Republican facts, and you listen to the Republicans, and they have a totally different story. And it plays into the cynicism and the frustration. Who do you believe? What are you supposed to think when you're not even sure about the information that you're getting? And in the meanwhile, you have hundreds of thousands of human beings who have their lives in our unsteady and capricious hands. The issue of immigration, like the issue of abortion, like the issue of guns, it has defied federal attempts at reasonable compromise or resolution. Washington has been close to an immigration bill many, many times, going back decades. They were always on the cusp of an agreement on immigration, but it always falls apart at the last minute. Pressure from the extreme left and the extreme right has essentially paralyzed the politicians. So they default to the old saying, quote, "The legislator who does nothing wrong," right? If you're going to generate heat and opposition for taking a position, then don't take the position. Don't pass the bill. And that is, in many ways, the default position for a legislative body, especially in Washington, D.C. I think it is the core of our problem overall, because that means the government doesn't function and it doesn't move forward and more people get more frustrated. But that's the reality. So let's, for purposes of this conversation, put the complexity of the overall immigration issue aside for now, because we have a particular problem, and that's the immediate crisis with the migrants on the southern border. And let's talk first actual facts. Fact, the southern border has long been a controversial, porous crossing for people coming from Mexico. You remember President Donald Trump wanted to build the wall on the southern border, and that became a controversial issue for years. But today's problem is different than what it was. Whereas in the past, most people crossing the border had been Mexicans, today it has shifted to more people from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Cuba. What the federal customs head, Chris Magnus, describes as people who are coming from failing communist regimes. And many of them are asylum seekers. Fact, since the 1980s, the federal government allowed asylum seekers to enter the United States, and they would remain in the United States while their asylum claim was being processed. Donald Trump changed that policy to require that the asylum seekers remain on the Mexico side of the border. Fact, President Biden took the opposite position in his presidential campaign, surprise, surprise. In February 2021, Biden announced he was ending the Trump administration policy, and asylum seekers could now be entering the United States, wait in the United States, pending their claim. State of Texas, state of Missouri, sue the federal government to stop the change. It goes up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules June 2022 that the Biden administration, in fact, does have the authority and enacts the policy change. Fact, the increased number of people entering the country created additional stress on what was already an overburdened immigration system. The immigration system has approximately 2 million pending cases and about 750,000 pending asylum claims. The increase with the policy shift also affected those border states, cities, and towns who have to manage the influx. For example, El Paso, which is a major crossing, has seen a 40% increase in the number of people coming through the city. Fact, Governor Abbott in Texas and Governor DeSantis in Florida have aggressively argued against the policy change and have argued that this would place an increased burden on their states. Recently, they began sending migrants to the so-called Democratic states, sanctuary cities like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and most dramatically, Governor DeSantis sent migrants to Martha's Vineyard. One of the prime locations for migrants to be sent is New York City. New York City has recently had an influx of 17,000 migrants at a cost to the city of $1 billion. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, like Governor Abbott and like Governor DeSantis, pointed out that this is not his problem. It's not a city problem, nor is it a problem that the city can handle on its own. And Mayor Adams actually declared a state of emergency in the city, prompted by the migrant situation. But Washington, D.C., Chicago, Atlanta, there are many other cities who are receiving the migrants and are in similar positions. Fact, on October 12th, President Biden then suddenly changed his position and used what's called Title 42, which was a Trump-era provision that stopped people at the border based on spreading COVID. And President Biden used that provision to cap the number of Venezuelan asylum seekers allowed to enter the country to 24,000. And he conditioned the arrivals that they must come by air travel and must have financial sponsorship. Many immigration groups have criticized the president's shift in policy. Fact, and if that's not complicated enough, on September 19th in Texas, Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar opened a criminal investigation against Governor DeSantis in connection with his transporting migrants to Martha's Vineyard. And the sheriff's investigation concerns the fact that the migrants may be victims of a crime, which would allow them then to remain in the country legally. So those are the facts. It is a political, legal, policy controversy that is playing out in the heat of an election. And it's affecting thousands and thousands of human beings. So first, let's ask the experts what they make of this situation. Joining us now is Jessica Vaughn. Jessica is Director of Policy Studies for the Center for Immigration Studies, and we thank her very much for joining us. Jessica, we just went through the facts of the situation, the original policy, the change that President Trump made, change that President Biden made, the influx of immigrants, the situation in Texas, the situation in Florida, the migrant shuffle, I call it, when those states sent migrants to other states. And then most recently, the change by President Biden in the policy vis-a-vis Venezuela. Before I steer you one way or another, Why don't you give us your general opinion and take on what's been happening?
Well, the situation at the border has been a disaster on so many levels. Not only a political disaster for the Biden administration, but creating an enormous burden on the destination communities, whether it's New York, Washington, D.C., Texas, Florida, all of the places that are destinations for the migrants. And it's creating enormous costs for schools, for healthcare, for housing, and all kinds of services that the migrants need. It's also a disaster for many of these migrants. We've seen unprecedented deaths at the border, horrible situations of human trafficking that are occurring now because the Biden administration policies are enticing people to put their lives in the hands of criminal smuggling organizations that are telling them correctly that if they come now, they will be allowed to stay in the United States almost indefinitely, and it causes them to make deals with traffickers who keep them in miserable living and working conditions to pay off their smuggling fees. And that's who the real winner is here, is the criminal smuggling cartels and all of the infrastructure that supports this illegal migration. And there's just a lot of costs and misery to go around. And it's time for the Biden administration to admit that something has to change. And I think that you're seeing a little bit of that with the change in policy toward the Venezuelans, but it is really too little and probably too late at this point to save the political damage and the fiscal and public safety damage that this crisis has inflicted on communities.
What do you think about Florida and Texas sending migrants to sanctuary states, sanctuary cities across the country?
Well, I think that clearly this was a political stunt, but one born out of frustration with the lack of change in the policies and with these governors feeling like they needed to drive home the point that there are problems created by this unchecked illegal migration, this historic level of people crossing illegally and being allowed to stay here without status. And I think that the leaders of some of these sanctuary cities like Washington, D.C. and New York City really played right into their hands and took the bait by starting to complain and make a big deal about how difficult it was to deal with this relatively small number of migrants who were sent by the governors. And so that really worked for both Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis as people saw, yeah, this is a big problem. And finally, they're having to confront it publicly.
Yeah. I agree that the increase in the influx should have been better anticipated by the federal government. You knew you were changing the policy. You knew it would actually attract more people. How did you think that was going to be handled, right?
That's right. They were briefed on this before, during the transition period, really, with the career immigration and border agencies told them, what they expected would happen.
Yeah. And I agree that they didn't anticipate it or they didn't make the preparations. I believe the federal government did drop the ball on that. And I also understand Governor Abbott's point and Governor DeSantis's point, because they are there and they are the first state to feel the impact. I thought the sending the migrants to other cities, you're right, it was a stunt. But I also think it took us to a new level in politics, and frankly, a new low in politics. Now, do we play politics in this country? Yes. Do we play politics with issues? Yes. Do we play politics during election seasons? Yes. But do you move people, put people in planes, send them to other locations where those locations are not ready to handle them? These are people who are already in a strange country. I think that was beyond the pale and literally playing politics with these migrants. So I just thought that was reprehensible as a political tactic. I understand the point they were trying to make, but I think there's still decency and human decency, even in politics, even in the United States. Let me ask you this, though. I understand your point on the immigration issue overall. If you look at the asylum issue, though, those refugees who are seeking asylum, this country has a long tradition of helping refugees who are being persecuted in other countries. And it goes back decades. And it's something that we're proud of. The people in Venezuela, they are being persecuted. Maduro kills people. UN study said between July and August 2020, 2,000 people were killed by the Maduro administration. So this is a legitimate refugee asylum issue that is being presented. And I think that should be treated separately and understand that that's a much different situation than the immigration issue overall. And when you start to cap those refugees, I think that's a problematic situation. Yes, go through the hearing. Yes, make sure it's all bona fide. But when you start to say, even though you have a legitimate asylum claim, where we're going to close the gate, that I have a problem with. What do you think?
Well, I agree. This is a very difficult issue, and there can be no question that the Venezuelan regime is oppressing and persecuting people, and that we should step up to provide safe haven to people in need. Absolutely. This is one of the finest traditions in our immigration policy throughout our history. And there are other situations in the world that merit our help as well, whether it's the Ukrainians or Syrians or Afghans and other countries around the world. The problem here is that first of all, it has to be an orderly legal process in conformance with the parameters that Congress has established. And also, we have to remember that many of the people who are flocking to our border now were already resettled in other countries in the region. And that's a key international principle to remember in considering what to do with displaced people, is that if someone is firmly resettled in a safe place, then they don't get to pick and choose where else they may go and expect to receive asylum. Now, we should do our share. And we should be helping out in coordination with other countries. But a lot of these people had settled in Colombia, Chile, even in Central America and Mexico. And the problem with the policies is that the Biden administration chose to no longer apply that provision of international and US law to say, if you are already okay in a third country, you don't need to come here. And this has ramifications for the rest of our humanitarian admissions, because if we get overwhelmed with people, then we can't easily manage other humanitarian assistance programs, whether it's the Afghans. I mean, we're seeing huge backlogs at the government agencies responsible for dealing with these cases. And there are other ways to help people as well. Like, we've already given temporary protected status to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who are already here, allowing them to work and receive benefits. And so, I think the United States is doing a lot, but I think that we should not be the sole destination country simply because we've just suspended application of the rules.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Jessica, if I can. The recent shift by the Biden administration capping Venezuelan asylum seekers at 24,000. Politically, I don't understand that, right? The old saying, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. I think the Biden administration did make a mistake not anticipating the influx and the practical reality of that. And now to make this policy shift suggests that the opponents are right and actually angered those people who were supportive of the president's policy. On a practical level, will this make any difference, the 24,000 cap on Venezuelans? I mean, will this have a significant difference in the problem that Texas and Florida are facing, or is it de minimis in the overall?
I think it will make a difference with respect to Venezuelans who may have been thinking about coming to the United States, because it's not just the numerical cap on applications, but also the requirement that anyone else seeking asylum must do it through a legal port of entry, or on an airplane, or with permission from the U.S. government to come here, and the fact that they're requiring people to have a sponsor within the United States. So I think that this will slow the flow of Venezuelans in particular. I'm not sure that it's going to do anything to affect the number of Cubans and Haitians and people from all over the world who are now coming. But the fact is that the largest numbers we've been getting in recent weeks have been Venezuelans. So, I think it is going to help. And it's, messaging is very important. The criminal smuggling organizations follow our immigration policies closer than most Americans do. And so they are going to realize that they may not have a market any longer with Venezuelans, and they're simply going to have to try to do something else.
Yeah. Why just a cap on Venezuelans? I mean, if you want to basically institute a quota system for asylum seekers, how about Nicaragua? How about Guatemala? How about Cuba? How about Haitians? How do they justify, or what is the justification for saying we're going to have a cap, but only on Venezuelans?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the question that naturally came to many people's minds, including my own, was, well, if we're going to do this with Venezuelans, what about all the rest? And that's why I think that this may be a little bit too little, too late. It's sort of acknowledging that, yeah, we can't let this go on. But it's not being applied to the other groups who are coming. It may also have something to do with our negotiations with the government of Mexico, because after all, people are going to be returned to Mexico, and Mexico may have wanted to put some conditions on who they were going to take back or who they were going to allow to wait in Mexico.
One final question for you, Jessica, which is an unfair question. I'm giving you notice. We've been watching the immigration debate, which has gone on for decades. I mentioned before that we've been on the cusp of having an immigration bill, I don't know how many times. Will the federal government pass an immigration bill, a real policy, in our lifetime? That's the question.
Well, I'd like to think yes. I think that the stars are aligning for some bills to be passed. I don't think we're going to see much change in the next 2 years if the Republicans take the House and maybe even the Senate, as people are predicting. I think there are still going to be very great limitations on what they can accomplish because of the numbers. But I do think that there is building public frustration with Congress's inability to get out of its own way on this issue. People want to see a modernized legal immigration system. They want to see immigration laws enforced. They want to see a secure border. And I believe that we can get there, but I think it's going to take a few more years, maybe little baby steps to build confidence before we can talk about any kind of an overhaul.
Yeah. I would go the other way on that question. I hope you're right. But At one time, there were just a few issues that we couldn't resolve, right? And immigration was up at the top of the list, and abortion and guns, the real hot button issues, if you will. But now I think Congress has gotten so accustomed to not touching any of these difficult issues. And the list has gotten much, much longer of the issues they're not resolving. So I think it's almost too easy for them to say, well, we don't agree, and that's how it works. But Jessica, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I think one thing Congress has learned is that these massive, comprehensive grand bargains are very, very difficult to get through. So if they can bite off pieces of the issue in smaller chunks, they can make progress. That's how immigration bills have passed throughout the last 30 years that I've been in this business. So I know Congress can do it. It's a matter of narrowing their focus and doing things, step by step.
I hope you are right. I hope optimism wins. Jessica, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and thank you very much for what you do. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Turning now to our next guest, Eric Rozo. Eric is a native Venezuelan. He actually founded a political party in Venezuela. He's currently studying at Columbia University, and he is also an activist for the Venezuelan community all across this country. So we thank him very much for being with us. Thank you for joining me, Eric. First, you've piqued my curiosity. Let me ask you, you founded a political party in Venezuela. What does that mean?
It means that 2/3 of my life, people like me, my age, we only known a regime that have been violating our rights and the freedom principles that our country was founded. And as a young Venezuelan, and among many others, we decided to get organized back in 2009 to build a political party trying to get us out of what we call the future, that bipartisan destruction of countries just by trying to take one side and not seeing the other.
Let me ask you this generally. We've been talking about the facts of the overall situation, and it really does come the most recent shift on the federal policy going to 24,000 for Venezuela. There is a particular impact, obviously, on Venezuela. And I am curious, there's basically a cap on Venezuela. There's no cap on the other countries, Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, etc. Yes, more Venezuelans were coming, but is it fair that the cap is just on Venezuela? And there's a difference between immigration policy and our policy vis-a-vis refugees and asylum seekers. And I see them as two very different situations, basically from a moral point of view. The situation with Maduro in Venezuela is terrible. This is an administration that literally kills people, right? So this is a legitimate refugee asylum seeker situation. And we take pride in this country, at least rhetorically and aspirationally, that we open our doors for people who are being persecuted. So what's your take on the situation and the most recent change about the cap on Venezuela?
Yeah, I think we need to see two things. First of all, that this policy actually is being replicated an executive decision that was made by the Biden administration and by executive, I believe it was only signed by his power on April, where they decided to open up this new parole, humanitarian parole for Ukrainians. So first of all, perhaps if the only country that we could compare this measure towards Venezuelans is Ukraine, because it doesn't have to happen through the Congress, neither through the Senate. It's just an executive measure that President Biden took back in April for Ukrainians. And yes, for Ukrainians, there was never a cap. the way that this measure was structured. It's not perfect, as we all know, but it could be perfectible, and that was the approach that we had back in September with many organizations that supported Ukrainians to come to the U.S. and even Welcome U.S., which is a national big NGO that helps refugees to resettle in this country and to access the communities that we are getting becoming part of. That being said, the case of Venezuela is completely different. And when we had some meetings, even the day after the Department of Homeland Security announced this new measure, we had so many questions because, yes, it's not only the cap of 24,000 Venezuelans per year, which they responded is just a number that could be increased just as many sponsors we would be able to find. So technically, if we find 24,000 economically capable people in the U.S. that is legally staying, they could help us to bring Venezuelans through this measure. However, the most important part, as you mentioned, is the fact that this is a substitutive measure. It's not necessarily a complementary measure that they should be taking into consideration. By the first fact, the Venezuelans are crossing the border because we don't have any lines or any flights directly from Venezuela to the U.S. First of all. Secondly, the fact that Venezuela and the U.S. don't have diplomatic relationships for many years, have increased the fact that many people don't have even access to a consulate to try to get any visa.
And if I understand it correctly, Eric, it's not just a cap. The people have to come by air, which is much harder than it sounds. They have to have a financial sponsor, so it will skew towards richer people. And you have to have a passport and a visa, right? Which means you'd have to go to the Venezuelan government to get the passport. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. And that's what it tells you, the fact that you don't customize a policy that was implemented for a Catholic, most likely white country where they have their government. Yes, it's a war. It's a completely different conditions that are happening or that Ukrainians are facing. But you cannot even try the fact that the Ukraine doesn't have any way, or Ukrainians doesn't have any physical territorial way to walk towards the U.S. tells you, and by having their government, that of course this policy makes sense by having a passport as a way to access that flight. But for Venezuelans that are through the region, Venezuelans that have no access to identity, that even within the country don't have access to say, and those are the numbers that the UN have said, keep reporting on the region, on even those nationals that are having kids and are not able to even register those kids in their country of origin, not even in the country of reception that they're staying.
Eric, well said. I'm curious, when you have the conversations with government officials, how do they explain two things? Why are Venezuelans being treated different than people fleeing the Ukraine? And second, why a cap on Venezuelans but no other country? How do they explain that?
Well, the Nicholson Institute, it's an institute that helped during the summer to organize at least 40 Venezuelan organizations around the U.S. that we decided to listen what was the volunteers for United for Ukraine, which was their first proposal to the Biden administration. So this is a proposal for this nonprofit, first of all. Then they started conversations with us on how could we implement an adaptation of it to propose it to the Alejandro Mayorkas, the Department of Homeland Security. And then when we sent that letter, just a week after, we got the response of this new measure being used as the final procedure to channel every Venezuelan situation in the U.S. Of course, then is when we had that meeting and we started asking all these questions. And apparently it was literally, and today we can see, it was supposed to be today, the day that they released what are those final requirements, or what are those final how it will look, that page where the sponsor can go and present a proposal with their financial information and the details on that Venezuelan refugee migrants that they will use the parole to bring towards the US. But as you say, when we started having these conversations, we say, I mean, but this is only benefits, it could only potentially beneficiate a certain sector of the Venezuelan society that is precisely, or perhaps those that are not necessarily at the core of the humanitarian emergency. Those are the ones that are walking the region right now. Those are the ones that are leaving everything that they have behind, even exposing themselves to be killed, to be kidnapped, or to be sexual harassed or abused in the jungle. There's several vulnerabilities that Venezuelans are facing that we cannot only look somewhere else thinking that, yes, this option have been effective to bring, and by the option I mean the parole, have been effective to bring more than 100,000 Ukrainians to the US in less than 6 months. So it's an effective tool, perhaps, but it needs to be customized to tackle Venezuelan situation and to try to support our communities and our people. Again, because the situation is completely different. We don't have a government that could give us a passport. We don't have applies to come to the US. Many other countries, even if the US recognize the expiration of our passport 5 years on top of the date that it says printed in your physical passport, there are several countries in the region that they do not recognize our passport. So even if you have the parole, you have an expired passport that it's still within that limit of the US, who are we to tell Colombia, to tell Panama, to tell any other country, let these people fly towards the US?
Yeah.
So it's in paper, it could look fantastic, but again, we are not all white population of Catholics, Europeans. This is a mixed country, a Latino country that is facing a completely unique situation.
Yeah. Well, Eric, let me say this. For myself, I think it's unfair. Doesn't even learn the lessons of the past, because we've been through this before in different situations in this country. And this, in many ways, replicates some of the mistakes we've made in the past. But it's unfair to Venezuela. There is no question but that the Maduro administration violates human rights, persecutes people, kills people. The journey, as you've so well described, from Venezuela to the United States is another journey of human rights abuses, and more people are on the way. And this is America at its best when it comes to people seeking asylum. Put aside the whole immigration politics. This is America, right? You're being persecuted, come here. So it's unfair, it's not right, and you're fighting the good fight, in my opinion. I'll leave you with this. My father, was former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, used to say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease in politics. I never knew what he was talking about. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. What he meant was the political system responds to those who make noise. You only get the political system to move if there's the generation of support and media and headlines and social media. So I'm on your side. Any way we can help, let us know. And I hope today people hearing your words understand the injustice that is involved, and I hope they take action. But thank you very much for being with us, Eric. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity and for help us to see opportunities not only for us as Venezuelans, but also to learn from other communities that have faced and have been better integrated in New York. That's why we personally decided to stay here within the US and call New York home. So thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you again, Eric.
Appreciate it.
So we heard from the experts. Let me give you my take on the situation. The state of Texas and the state of Florida do have a legitimate problem. But it is also clear that they're playing politics with this issue. Now, you can say, well, playing politics is nothing new. And you're right, especially on the topic of immigration, and especially in the middle of the election season. But using human beings as pawns on the political chessboard is a new low. And it is revolting, I believe, on a number of levels. The migrant shuffle may very well have been illegal, and Governor DeSantis is under criminal and civil investigations for his Martha's Vineyard stunt. He chartered planes at taxpayer expense and allegedly deceived migrants into making the trip. The investigation is serious, and it should be thoroughly pursued. And I believe Governor DeSantis has real trouble coming his way. And frankly, I believe he should. I also believe the Biden administration handled this poorly. This was not a surprise. And this was all of their own doing. They announced the policy in the campaign in 2020. They enacted it February 2021. They were then in court with it until June 2022. All that time, they failed to adequately anticipate the consequences of their actions. When you change the policy, you must have the program in place to manage the change. That's Government 101. And here they dropped the ball. The federal government must now play catch up, and they have to do it quickly. And in the meantime, they must assume responsibility for the emergency situation in sanctuary cities. They should be providing the facilities and the personnel and the financial resources. It is not New York City's problem, and it is not Atlanta's problem. Immigration has always been a federal responsibility. And this sudden migrant influx was caused by the federal government. I'd also like to see states be of more assistance to cities. For example, New York City is a sanctuary city. Yes, but New York State is a sanctuary state. And let the states come in and help the city with that burden. Let the states come in and take a portion of the migrant population and put them in other parts of the state so you don't overburden the facilities of any one city. And then the recent sudden shift in President Biden's policy capping Venezuelan entrance to 24,000. That only highlights the mishandling of the entire matter, and it resolves nothing. If the president believes his position was right, then stick with your position. If the president believes he made a mistake, then he should have admitted it and reversed course. But there is no middle position. And his shift has now fueled the opposition. It has angered those who supported his original policy, and he winds up reneging on a campaign promise. It is a lose, lose, lose. And let's take a step back and be honest about the context for all of this and our history. My opinion is the issue of immigration has always been a case of American schizophrenia. Yes, the Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus, give us your tired, your poor. That was the aspirational, idealistic view of America. But at the same time, there has always been an opposing position which is based on fear of the unwashed masses, that they would come in and overwhelm the population of quote-unquote original Americans. Early on, they were primarily white Protestants, and they were afraid they would become a minority in their own country. There was even the widely held belief that these new immigrants, Italians, Greeks, Irish, Polish, Jewish, were inferior breeds who would pollute the American gene pool. There was a significant school of eugenics that believed society's ills could be traced to people with inferior ability and intellect. As a matter of fact, some went so far as to say those inferior breeds should not be allowed to reproduce. Remember, this country involuntarily sterilized close to 100,000 people because they were mentally ill, they were disabled, or they were considered criminals. America's xenophobia actually increased after World War I. President Calvin Coolidge represented the anti-immigrant feeling when he said, "America must be kept American. America must be kept American." How interesting. Past his prologue. What President Coolidge said sounds a lot like the slogans that are being used today in the campaigns in Europe. Then in 1924, this country passed the Johnson-Reed Act that established the quota system for immigration. That system favored Northern European countries with white Protestant populations. As a matter of fact, it banned all Asian immigration to this country. On the issue of refugees and people seeking asylum, our history is even more unsettling. At the beginning of World War II, the anti-immigrant movement was compounded by anti-Semitism. We effectively closed the doors when the Jewish community was fleeing Nazi Germany. We knew the plight of the Jews in Poland. We knew the slaughter, the carnage. We knew the evil. We even knew of the concentration camps. And we had ships of Jewish refugees, which we refused to allow in our ports. This country only engaged when it was clear that this country's interest was in peril. So, our inclusive rhetoric has always been at odds with our nativist and protectionist interests. 100 years later, the issue is still unresolved. The tension still exists. The difference between who we like to believe we are versus who we actually are. The idealized version of America versus the reality. Our better angels, opposed by the instinctive fear of those who are different, and our own self-interest. Something to think about. I hope to see you next week, and in the meantime, I hope to hear from you. Please, your questions, your issues, tell me what's on your mind so we can work it through together.